Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, and welcome to the Ideas Roadshow podcast. I'm Howard Burton, your host and creator of Ideas Roadshow, and I'm delighted to be partnering with the New Books Network to offer you our uniquely eclectic blend of long-format conversations with a wide array of experts across many different subjects. The following discussion is a reformatted podcast version of one of Ideas Roadshow's first 100 film conversations that's available in print as both an individual ebook and as part of a 5-conversation collection in ebook and paperback. Visit ideasroadshow.com for more details. What does a quiet, unassuming 17th century Dutch lens grinder, banished from Amsterdam's Jewish community, have to teach us about the modern world? Well, according to philosopher Susan James of Birkbeck College, London, quite a lot, actually. The lens grinder in question is, of course, Baruch or Benedictus Spinoza, and like many current thinkers, Susan believes that a close reading of his thoughts can greatly assist us in better understanding and appreciating a wide range of issues of contemporary relevance, from the nature of community, to political and religious diversity, to even a greater appreciation of and respect for the environment. I thought we'd begin by just talking about how you became interested in philosophy and how you became interested in early modern philosophy and history, and in fact, history writ large and philosophy writ large.
Well, I went to quite an academic school, and I think that at the end of my schooling, I was searching around for something that I really wanted to study. I came from a very scientific family, which was oriented in that direction, and I wasn't.
What sort of science?
My father was a biologist, and my mother worked in sort of psychiatry. So, and they weren't terribly keen on me doing, one of the straight humanities subjects like history or English. And I think, now I think differently about it, but at the time I didn't especially want to do that myself. So somebody suggested, well, why don't you think about studying philosophy? So that's, as it were, how I started to read a little bit, and it seemed to appeal to a kind of mixture of things I was interested in. It had a certain amount of rigour and toughness about its argument. It was also quite historical and quite literary. And so for those sorts of reasons, I suppose, or who knows what the real reasons were, anyway, I ended up applying to Cambridge to read philosophy.
And you read philosophy on your own when you were in school, or was this part of the academic curriculum?
There was no philosophy taught in schools at that point, but we did have in my school a wonderful English teacher who was a very inspirational character in all ways. And she read a bit of Plato with us and things like that. So that was thinking that Plato was all wrong in the Republic was really the way I came into philosophy, I think.
Well, there are some things, at least for me, when I first read the Republic, that were terribly shocking when I was a young person, because I thought, here's this great canon of Western literature, and there are things in there that are quasi-fascist that you just come across saying, this is crazy. How could anybody believe this sort of thing?
Yes, and you're expected to revere this figure.
Yes, exactly.
So that, yeah.
And what did your parents think of that? When was philosophy okay? Was that something that was?
Yeah, no. I think that my parents, although this isn't how I've presented them, were very liberal. I think they were fine with it. And so that was how I started to study philosophy at university. And that was very strange because philosophy in Cambridge at that time, more than now, was extremely narrowly analytic. And so it was I found it very hard to learn to swim in it, if you know what I mean. It didn't come naturally to me at all that These were the sorts of questions. And I think it was partly because you were just presented with problems and nobody told you or encouraged you to think about how did that come to be a problem? Or, why did anybody ever get interested in that? And so I think to that extent, my sort of preferences were always a bit historical. I always liked to know sort of how it came about that the problem took this shape.
Did you find any kindred spirits at Cambridge who were looking at things in the same way that you were, either as colleagues or on the faculty?
Well, I had one. There was one man who very briefly supervised me. He's called James Hopkins, and he really showed me sort of how this could be done by giving me a kind of historical map. We were talking about Kant, and so he said, well, Descartes comes here, Locke comes here, Hume comes here, and so there was, and I didn't really understand what he was talking about at the time, but I think that sort of, I remember it. I think it was an important moment.
Right.
And then also, there was an amazing woman called Mary Hesse, who taught us philosophy of science, and then I went to work with her for my PhD. So
what did you do in philosophy of science? What specifically?
She had just started working in the philosophy of the social sciences, which was, a kind of, for her, a new field, and nobody else much was thinking about it in philosophy around there at that point. And so I was interested in holistic forms of social explanation, and that was what I wrote about first of all.
It's interesting because it's somewhat unusual, at least in my experience, for people to have remained at the same institution from their undergraduate degree all the way through their doctorate. And my understanding is you did this at Cambridge, and you did this within an overall ambient climate, if I understand it correctly, that was oriented towards analytic philosophy to a rather strong extent. So I would have thought naively, knowing nothing, which is, as it happens, where I am, I would have thought that you would have had extra motivation perhaps to go somewhere else or experience other areas. But I guess moving into philosophy of social science was sufficiently removed or not.
I don't think I was very sort of strategic or well organised about what I was doing. And I didn't actually stay in Cambridge all the time of my PhD. I went as a kind of unofficial visiting student to Princeton. And although that wasn't exactly getting out of an analytical climate, it was tremendously educational and also very refreshing. I mean, I worked there a little bit. I was helped a little bit by Richard Rorty and Raymond Geuss in particular, and that made the most enormous difference to my thinking about it.
So what specifically were their influences?
Well, for one thing, they were encouraging, which is always a great help when you're a PhD student. So yeah, it's fine, just carry on. And I think that both of them were interested in the work that I was doing. A little bit, they were nice to me about the work that I was doing, which was about trying to, as it were, use some historical and social scientific sources to sort of examine philosophical questions. I think they both liked that. And Raymond Geuss at that time was working on the book that eventually became The Idea of Critical Theory. So from him I learnt, just going to his classes and going to his lectures and things, I learnt about critical theory for the first time. And he also was trying to subject this literature to a very narrow, sort of philosophical lens. So that was helpful too, what you can and what you can't do in that way.
Did you have an opportunity to mix broadly with people at both at the university and at the institute at the time across different disciplines? My sense is that was a particularly interesting and dynamic time to be at the institute as well as to be at the university.
I mean, I think I was incredibly privileged. I mean, because although I had absolutely no sort of official status in these things, I was sort of around, so actually I think I must have been one of those graduate students who's hanging about a lot and who's sometimes pretty annoying, but yes, I mean, at the Institute, Quentin was working with Goetz and Hirschman, and Thomas Kuhn was there, and So that was quite astonishing. And the philosophy department was also, at that time, an absolutely astonishing department. David Lewis and Tom Nagel, as well as the figures I've mentioned, and many more. So it was a wonderful but also extremely intimidating intellectual environment.
So, Spinoza, how did you fall under the Spinozistic spell?
Well, Spinoza really came along quite a bit later when I had a lectureship in Cambridge, and by then I'd sort of finished the book that I wrote about the philosophy of the social sciences, and I was sort of interested in just doing something quite different, and I started to work on early modern epistemology. And anyway, I was given this job, and one of the conditions of the job was the chairman told me that I had to give lectures on Spinoza.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because somebody had to do it, and he was fed up of doing it, and he thought, well, no, she can do it. And actually that was the most enormous gift, because I didn't really know hardly anything about Spinoza, but I had to learn, I had to try and learn fairly fast. I gave some pretty dreadful lectures, and I got very excited by it.
Why early modern philosophy? You said you became interested in that, and then you were forced to give these lectures and so forth. But what was it about the early modern period that appealed to you?
Well, first of all, I was interested in issues about skepticism. And at the time, I mean, as you'll know, I'm sure, there was a great deal of interest in skepticism, as it were. That was a kind of really major historical topic and theme, as of course it still is, but somehow there was a sort of new impetus of work under the influence of Richard Popkin in particular. And so I think it was that, probably reading his books, that made me excited about that. So that's what I started to work on. But that for me was sort of a bit of a dead end. It turned out not to be exactly what I wanted to do. And one of the things that I was struck by, I think, about Spinoza was that skepticism really doesn't play a role in his philosophy. So he seemed to be like quite an interesting sort of counterexample. But I should say that at that point I was reading the ethics, and so it was that aspect of his work that I was interested in. I don't think I really knew very much about the political work at that time.
And the ethics is obviously different as a professional philosopher, but nonetheless the ethics is not easy. It almost seems to me like jumping into the deep end. Would you agree or disagree with?
Totally agree. I mean, I think there's a strange division of labour in Spinoza studies, which is only just breaking down, which is that the philosophers read the ethics and the political theorists read maybe the TTP, and nobody very much reads the TP. And that's no longer true, but I think it was very much like that. So that, if you were studying Spinoza, that was what you read. And that was just sort of the bit of the way the canon was formed. So one of the things I've been interested in really is to, along with lots of other people, is to try to break down those barriers.
Right. So let's start at the beginning and give a brief description of the lay of the land, as it were. So here's this guy starting off living in Amsterdam and born in the 17th century. And tell me a little bit more about him and what his life was like, first of all, before we move on to some of his core ideas and why we should pay attention to them today.
Yeah. Well, Spinoza had rather an interesting life, I think. He was born into the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam, where his family was quite well established as a merchant. And he was the child of his father's second wife. He had a number of siblings, and he grew up in in the local community. He went to the local synagogue school and he was trained accordingly. In his teens particularly, really perhaps throughout his young life, many bad things happened. He lost his mother, he lost 2 of his siblings, he lost his father. And it seems to be true, although there isn't much documentary evidence of this, that he took over his father's business, perhaps when his father died or became ill. And so he began his life as a merchant in the import-export business of dried fruit from the Sephardic Peninsula in North Africa, which was a big trade in Amsterdam at the time. Things like ginger were extremely popular. And then, for reasons also that we don't quite understand, Spinoza seems to have fallen out with the synagogue, both intellectually and financially. So he seems to have been in debt. He seems to have refused to pay his debts. He also, we suppose, may have been at loggerheads with them about philosophical and theological matters. And in his early 20s, he was excommunicated. Fairly decisively excommunicated. The curse, the cherem that was pronounced over him is quite, sends a shiver down your spine.
It's almost unprecedented, isn't it? I mean, in terms of its vitriolic nature, my understanding is it was a particularly emphatic denunciation.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think people were excommunicated quite regularly, but it was a sort of disciplinary procedure, and then you said you were sorry and they allowed you to come back. But in this case, it sounds pretty final, and it was final. I'm sure it's not true as the curse requires that nobody ever spoke to him again, but his life seems to have taken a very different tack at that point, and he seems to have started to train himself, or could perhaps continue to train himself, in Latin and in classical philosophy, and he seems to have gone to some lectures in Cartesian philosophy at the University of Leiden, and set himself up as a sort of independent philosopher of no religious affiliation, which is an unusual way for somebody to live in the 17th century.
I wanted to ask you a question about the Latin, because this has always confused me, because he wrote all of his works in Latin, is that correct?
Dutch and Latin, yes.
Okay,
there's an early work which is in Dutch, but everything else is in Latin, yes.
And he learned Latin from Van Ende or whatever. I'm not sure people know exactly, but it seemed like he was remarkably competent and prolific to be able to write philosophical treatises in Latin. I'm sure his Latin wasn't at a Ciceronian level or whatever, but I'm in no position to say. But just the idea of somebody having only gone to night school or been with this guy for a couple of years and then writing philosophical treatises, that alone seems rather remarkable to me. Yes, it is. And his linguistic skills were obviously quite broad, because he would have spoken Portuguese at home, he knew Dutch, he knew Latin, and arguably some other languages as well. Mm. But then if you think about it, Latin was sort of access to the intellectual community. If you wanted to talk to people around the world, or if he and Henry Oldenburg wanted to have a conversation, then it looks as though you've got to be able to have it in Latin. Sure, but he didn't have, my understanding is he didn't, as so many scholars would have, he didn't learn Latin in his formative years. He didn't.
No, absolutely, you're right, yeah. That's right. So he learned Hebrew in his formative years, exactly, which came in handy as well. Right. But Latin came later.
Right.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you. So he was excommunicated, and he began living this life of an independent scholar, as you say.
Yeah, and it seems to have had a very wide-ranging circle of sort of intellectual associates, all sorts of people from all sorts of different social and religious backgrounds who, as it were, came together, usually in association with some religious movement. For example, a lot of Spinoza's friends belonged to this thing called the collegiate movement, which was sort of radical, minimalist form of religion, and so on. But yeah, so he had quite a busy social life, exchanging letters and visits with lots of people.
And to support himself, my understanding is he ground lenses, right? Is that...
Yeah. I think it's difficult to know whether he really supported himself from grinding lenses or whether he may have had some other funds, already. He lived in a very modest way. You can go to see one or two of the houses where he lived, and he just rented a room in somebody's house, and there he was. But he did grind lenses, and at the time, as you know, that was a sort of gentlemanly, a sort of somewhat gentlemanly skill. It was part of an entree into the scientific community, and there seem to have been some of the leading local scientists, including Huygens, who really liked his lenses, and so it put him in touch with them.
One of the things that you just alluded to is also struck me as curious and interesting about the Spinoza story. So here's this person who seemed to be a remarkably independent person. I mean, somebody who had the ability to weather the storms of the society that excommunicated him, never went on bended knee asking for forgiveness or to be re-included in the community in any way. He said, okay, fine, I'm on my way. Thank you very much. Had a great deal, it seems to me, of intestinal fortitude to be able to live independently without being someone of obvious means, without being someone of obvious connections. And yet, and in many ways had a very intellectually rigorous, to the point of being stark, outlook. And at the same time was clearly somebody who had a plethora of friends, a circle of very fervent admirers. So much so that my understanding is one of the reasons we know so much about Spinoza and his writings is that after he died, that circle ensured that his works would survive, and they published an opus. They published his writings. I think they burned some of his personal letters and so forth, which was unfortunate. But anyway, they certainly took great care to preserve his thoughts, and presumably these people were also involved in, as you say, corresponding with him, regarding him as a mentor. And I'm just not sure how that came to be, because it seems very different. You have this solitary, isolated, hugely rigorous, independent thinker over here, but at the same time you have somebody who was obviously so well integrated into a circle, an intellectual circle, and clearly values friendship.
I mean, you're absolutely right. It is interesting. Two things come to mind. I mean, one is that I think Spinoza was a pretty aggressive person. He would not give up, so he fights the rabbis and he says, all right, well, excommunicate me, I don't care. And he publishes the TTP and he says, all right, vilify me, I don't care. He just, there's a certain kind of obstinacy in him. But also, I suppose it's important that although he has his philosophy is not like anyone else's, nonetheless, it is one of the, the part of the advice of the philosophy, that you should live, as it were, with the support of other people.
Yes.
So I think that sometimes Spinoza is trying to live up to the demands of his own philosophy, and that, the philosophy says, you won't be able to manage, you won't get anywhere if you don't have friends and people who support you, and networks, as we would say. And he does. And, the philosophy says you've really got to, as it were, cultivate the courage to live in the light of your own best understanding. And so maybe one should think, for example, about his decision to publish the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus as him sort of saying, okay, well, that is what I understand, and so I've got to do it, even though it's in other ways extremely rash.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about that, and that set the stage. So my understanding is that he only published 2 works in his lifetime. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So he first published this some analysis of the principles of Cartesian philosophy of the Meditations in this rigorous mathematical form. And then he published the Tractatus, although I think he did that under a different name, right? Is that correct?
And a sort of false imprint. Why don't we take the principles of Descartes' principles of philosophy first?
Yes.
And so this is one of the first things that Spinoza does. And it's written in a context where there is a very intense and full-blown conflict between philosophers who identify themselves as Aristotelians and are committed to a certain kind of scholastic Aristotelianism of a thoroughly Christian sort, and philosophers who identify themselves as Cartesians. Cartesianism is kind of the new thing, and in the Dutch universities, as you know, there's a big struggle about whether Cartesian philosophy can be taught, and one of the reasons given against it is that Cartesianism propounds principles which are in conflict with principles supported not only by Aristotle but also by the Bible, and so there's a kind of sort of philosophical and theological dispute going on, and this is very fierce. This runs from the 1640s when a professor of theology, very powerful guy at the University of Leiden called Voetius, tries to suppress Descartes' work. Descartes is extremely annoyed.
So what are his arguments? Tell us a little bit more about what's bothering him about Cartesian philosophy and about Descartes from a religious perspective.
So here's an example. These sort of Calvinist Aristotelians, as they are, think that you have to derive your philosophy from the Bible. That's as it were the bedrock. And so as long as your philosophical views are in sync with the Bible, then they're at least, as it were, worthy of consideration. And as they see it, Cartesianism, particularly in some of its physical principles, is out of sync. For example, they read the Bible as offering support for an anti-Copernican position, and they appeal to the battle of Joshua with the Ammonites, where the sun stands still in the sky. And they infer that the author of that passage was not a Copernican, whereas Cartesians are Copernicans. So that's, as it were, the kind of dispute that they're having fundamentally, I think. Anyway, to get back to Spinoza, when he produces this sort of tidied up version of the first part of Descartes' principles, where what he does is to, instead of just sort of explaining the view as Descartes does in his principles, he puts it all in so-called geometrical order. He turns it into a series of proofs and demonstrations. He's kind of announcing that he is a Cartesian. He's sort of publicly joining himself with that group. So that's, I think, part of the motivation for writing that. But also, he is profoundly engaged with Cartesianism, so there's obviously a prior philosophical interest.
Right. And something that a modern reader might not appreciate, as I understand it, is the word philosophy and philosophizing from a Spinozistic perspective is much more akin to what today we might regard as mathematical or scientific, insofar as Spinoza is looking to use philosophy to establish knowledge that he regards as certain, just like mathematical certainty. And so my sense is when he talks about philosophical understanding and philosophical approaches, he's aiming for mathematical certainty. Would that be a fair assessment or not?
I mean, I think that's right. That is his aspiration. He says, I'm going to treat all these psychological and moral matters that I discuss in the ethics as though it were a matter of lines and planes, as though we were just doing geometry and our conclusions were as certain as geometrical ones. And as you know, geometry was always treated as a sort of paradigm of certainty and clarity and deductive reasoning. So it's perfectly true that does seem to be his aspiration. And I think that, in a way, that's quite in a line with Descartes. Descartes doesn't always bother to do that, but he doesn't ever say you couldn't.
Right.
And so it's as though Spinoza is taking Descartes' work and saying, okay, well, let's tidy this up. But then he, of course, much later, he's carrying that over into his own magnum opus, the Ethics, where he's, starting from his own principles and deducing his own conclusions.
Right. But he doesn't write the Tractatus, you call it the TTP, which is a much more intelligent way of doing it because I'm going to stumble over the words, but Theological Politicus, is that Politico? Okay, well, now I'm looking at your book, you see, to try to...
Yeah. The Theologico-Political Treatise is not written like that, no, and I think it's not, as it were, strictly speaking, a work of philosophy. And it's written for a different kind of audience. Because obviously if you write in this very arcane way, you're writing for a particular set of people who know how to deal with that stuff.
Right.
And the TTP is written, I think, for a much broader audience of educated but ordinary people. And it's written in prose.
So here we are. We're now in the, where are we? 1660s. So they're 1670s. When does this come out? He died in, what is it?
It's published in 1670, but he's writing it from 1665.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're in 1665, and Descartes has come and gone, and there are all sorts of controversies within contemporary Dutch society. In terms of the appropriateness of teaching Cartesian philosophy. At the same time, living in Holland is, and I can say this because my wife is Dutch, so I know Holland is really a province and all the rest of this, but we can... So living in Holland at the time, is also considered by many people to be the most liberal and progressive environment, notwithstanding the controversies that I hope we're going to that we'll get to momentarily. And that's, of course, the principal reason why Descartes had been there to begin with.
Yes.
So what's going on with him? Why does he write it, and who is he writing it for?
Maybe just a tiny bit about the sort of political environment at the time. So the quarrel that we were just discussing between Cartesians and sort of scholastic Aristotelians, the sort of political theological quarrel, escalates very quickly from the early 50s into a major sort of theologico-political split as well, because people who are Cartesians roughly ally themselves with the Republican Party, and people who are scholastic Aristotelians roughly ally themselves with the Stadtholder's Party, with the kind of proto-monarchical figure in the Constitution. And there's therefore a political struggle for power that goes on, which is aligned with a theological struggle about, as it were, who has control over religion and how much freedom of religion there is, and at the same time a philosophical struggle. Are we Cartesians? Do we allow Cartesians? So it's a very complicated set of sort of situations. And throughout the 1650s, I think that this thing is sort of comes to be held stable, and the Grand Pensionary of the time, the leader of the government, De Witt, holds things in balance.
Right.
But in the 60s, in the early 60s, he starts to lose power. The situation becomes more perilous. The sort of right-wing party, as it were, the Stadtholder's Party, gains influence. And so the situation of radical Cartesians such as Spinoza becomes more vulnerable. So you might think that's a good time to keep quiet, but that's not what Spinoza does at all. So he says, writing to Oldenburg, that he feels that he has to speak out for the freedom to philosophize, and he also has to, as it were, put the record straight with people who say that he's an atheist. So somebody is complaining about him. We don't really know a great deal about exactly who, and he decides to, as it were, produce a book. And the point of the book, he says, is to show that the freedom to philosophize and the freedom to pursue your own religious views are not only compatible with the security of the state, but they're also conditions of the security of the state.
Right.
So that's the plan.
And so he comes out with this, and what's the reaction?
The reaction, when he publishes it, when it's finished in 1670, and the reaction is fairly virulent. He's widely attacked, indeed, as an atheist, and for holding views that are heretical. This isn't at all surprising. He does say some very radical and dramatic things, and he must have known that that would happen.
Yes.
So he doesn't. I don't think he's particularly shaken by it.
So hence his stubbornness, or in keeping with his stubbornness, as you were saying.
Yeah.
One of the things that he sets in his sights is this notion of superstition. And he accuses the reigning Dutch Reformed clergy, the anti-Cartesian wing, the right wing, however one would like to describe it, or at least he insinuates that they are people who rely upon superstition. What does he mean by that?
Well, he not only insinuates, he really he vilifies them in the opening chapter of his book. So, that isn't a very sort of diplomatic move. So Spinoza holds the philosophical view that in our ordinary ways of engaging with the world, we're very susceptible to our passions, and we're very susceptible to imagine the world in ways that we find frightening. I'm contracting various complexities there, but so one of the things that fear can do to you, he thinks, is to make you superstitious, by which he doesn't just mean make you have sort of crazy beliefs, but make you as kind of inherently fearful of everything and unable to cope with the world. So it can, in its extreme forms, produce really conditions of complete breakdown. People don't sleep, they don't know what to do with themselves. And so he regards superstition in general as an extraordinarily damaging thing, because it makes people afraid. That in turn makes them aggressive. And it puts them sort of in the grip of a kind of fear that they haven't got a way to cope with. Yeah. Partly because it's very undirected. Just everything becomes frightening, is how he thinks about it. And he thinks that a lot of the Reformed Church's preachers, I don't suppose this is completely wrong, are sort of fomenting superstition in their sermons. They're breathing hellfire at people. They're telling them that they're hopelessly lost, that they have no chance of salvation, and so on. And that this produces a kind of condition of intellectual stasis, as it were. People just stop being able to think for themselves. Mm. And he also thinks that the officials of the church are cynical in doing this. They're doing it to manipulate people to bolster their own prestige. And I think he also thinks that, in a way, they too may be in the grip of superstition sometimes, that they've lost it. So he regards this as a very widespread form of corruption, and it's sort of the antithesis, as far as he's concerned, of what religion ought to be.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, because from a modern perspective, you could imagine that this guy is the Richard Dawkins of his age. You could imagine that he's accusing the priesthood of manipulating the people. He believes in the power of rationality and rational thought. And he would be one of these virulent, reason above all, atheistically oriented, natural science type of people that we see around us today. And I suppose it's a matter of debate whether that categorization is appropriate, but at least by his own words, he certainly says that he is somebody who is a religiously oriented person, and he goes to a great deal of trouble in this work to establish his religious credentials. He examines prophecy, he examines revelation, he examines the Bible, he examines the Bible to establish not only his credentials, but apparently an argument for what the Bible is actually saying, which one could imagine would certainly step on a lot of people's toes who are in the business of using the Bible. I'm not asking a question, which I should be doing, but which I'll get to in a moment. But what's curious to me is that he does embrace the Bible, and he does want to show his religious credentials very, very strongly. And I guess a question that I have as I'm reading your book and as I'm occasionally going back to his book is, does he really believe this? Or is this an argument on his part?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of debate about this. I mean, some people think of him as somebody who is a completely, as it were, naturalistically inclined philosopher and who doesn't really have any theological interest. I don't agree with that at all. I think he's completely sincere in his arguments about the Bible. They're not always very good arguments, just if you look at them from scratch, but I don't think that undermines his sincerity. So I think he's doing two things. And first of all, he's arguing with his opponents on their own territory on the grounds that, as well, that will be the only way to even enter into conversation with them. So they think that everything comes from the Bible, all right, but also, in addition to that, I think that he's working out an argument about the way that imagining works and a lot of, the way that we work psychologically through the case of the Bible. And it's really tremendously interesting, his view.
So tell me a little bit about that. Describe the difference between imagining and being philosophical and using philosophical rigor according to Spinoza's definitions.
Well, there's a sort of schematic way to put this, and then I think what he actually does is more complicated. But what he says is that there are two sort of ways of thinking. There's a philosophical way of thinking, which is as it were where you start out from, you deal with general matters, you're not interested in particulars, and you start out with some truths, some axioms, principles that, and you infer other truths from them. So it's a very general and self-contained and supposedly certain form of thinking. And then by contrast with that is imagining, which is the ordinary, messy way we think. We rely on our sensory perceptions, we're rooted in our experience of particulars, we remember things, we fantasize about things. We're all in a bit of a mess and a muddle. That's imagining.
Right.
And the Bible, Spinoza thinks, falls into the category of an imaginative work.
So I want to get into the Bible as a narrative and the idea of why we should pay attention to it from Spinoza's perspective. But before I do, it seems to me that a point worth highlighting is this whole notion of prophecy and prophets, because my understanding is that the religious establishment would look at these individuals, the prophets of the Bible, as people who were the vessels of God, and therefore paragons not only of virtue and morality, but also of every other human quality, intellect, ability, and so forth. And Spinoza disagrees with this, as I understand it, and says, well, they were clearly wonderful people from, again, my words, from a moral perspective. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they were the brightest people in the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were the most rigorous in terms of philosophical ability. They were people who were particularly perspicuous in terms of their imaginative faculties. Is that a fair statement? And you can see that by saying this, he's doing two things. He's clearly setting up a divide between the faculty of imagination and philosophical rigor. But he's also going to be raising the hackles of many people within the established religious community. Did people latch on to this specific aspect right away, or were there other things that were more damning about some of his analysis?
No, you're absolutely right. This is one of the things that, as it were, went to the heart of the quarrel, because maybe the first step is that Spinoza is opposing people who think, as you say, that the prophets speak with the voice of God. And this is, this is in the Catechism of the Dutch Reformed Church and so on at the time. So it's an absolutely standard view. And his first objection is to say, look, God isn't the sort of creature, being, thing who speaks to anybody. This kind of anthropomorphic construction of God is just completely unviable. But nonetheless, there is something amazing about the prophets, as you say. So what is it? So then other people have said the prophets have astonishing intellects. They know all this amazing physics and stuff, and they also have wonderful imaginations because they tell us these beautiful stories that, move us, make us want to be good. And Spinoza says that they don't have fantastic intellects. There's absolutely no evidence for that because they say all sorts of things that we know to be wrong. But they do have amazing imaginations. That's to say, they're people who, as it were, are sensitized to the world and their situations in ways that most of us aren't, and they're able, therefore, to make suggestions and predictions about what's going to happen and how we ought to behave and, as it were, what will be good for us in a way that we find, or that the people they're talking to find compelling. And this is a view that is not, as it were, sort of completely opposed to things that his opponents are saying. They too think that, that the prophets speak with the vulgar, and they too think that, as it were, you have to make some discriminations between, when people are prophesying and when they're not, and so forth. But Spinoza's view is just, as it were, harder hitting.
Right.
In that it says, you don't have to worry about this biblical physics. As far as physics and, by which he means natural philosophy is concerned, you don't have to take the prophets seriously at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So the one issue which I think bears repeating that you had alluded to is this notion of, in Joshua, the quote that the sun is standing still during a battle, which implies that, well, normally the sun is moving, but if one is a Copernican, one says, well, the sun's actually never moving. It's us who are moving. And
yes.
I wanted to talk about this idea of accommodation that you're alluding to, because on the one hand, you could argue, well, the prophets are all-knowing, or at least maybe not all-knowing, but extremely well-established individuals with this incredibly high intellect. And when they are using metaphors and analogies and so forth, they are doing it in such a way to best communicate to the people, to the vulgar, the normal people. And so they are deliberately
suppressing their insights,
or speaking in a way which may not be literally true, but is the best possible way to communicate the insights to the masses and so forth. And it seems to me that this cuts both ways, because on the one hand, Spinoza is aware of the fact that yes, this does happen all the time, and yes, it is important to be able to use the Bible as a narrative form, to be able to, it's a good thing to be able to share with other people. But on the other hand, it seems to me that if what he is saying, if according to him, these people do not have the highest possible level of intellect, they actually really believe these particular stories.
I think he thinks they do. I don't think he thinks they're pulling the wool over people's eyes, but that in telling these stories, what they're doing is, as well, conveying these insights as in the only way that they know how, which is as narrative and as were in the context of an audience to whom they're speaking. And one of the advantages of this, Spinoza thinks, is that you can explain the behaviour of prophets just in terms of human psychology.
Right.
You don't have to appeal to divine intervention or anything to illuminate what's going on.
So there's that. There's the fact that the prophets aren't necessarily these supermen. One can understand the dynamics by appealing to human psychology. And then there's looking at the Bible itself and recognizing that through a very clear and precise hermeneutical understanding of the Bible, and historical understanding and linguistical analysis, one can draw all sorts of conclusions that certainly highlight the fallibility of the Bible itself. That there were problems in terms of historical translation, that it's certainly not a perfect representation of the mind of God, that words have evolved, and so the reason why words were this way rather than that way is because people forgot the old definitions of words and so forth, and you can clear up all sorts of mysteries by looking at this as a work that was actually written by men.
Yes.
And so it seems to me that if you believe that prophets can be understood as people who have this remarkable degree of imagination and they have a high degree of sensitivity in terms of psychology, how they interact with other individuals. If you believe that the Bible is something that is not the inviolate work of God, but is in fact a work of men over the centuries, which has morphed into this and that as things tend to do, then the obvious question is, well, why should we really pay attention to any of this at all?
Yeah, exactly. And Spinoza addresses that question in a way which is also, to his contemporaries, very disturbing, because he says, look, what makes the Bible sacred and means we should pay attention to it is that for us here and now, it's an extremely important source of ideas which help us to live well. They help us to live in a pious and religious fashion. But if they didn't, it would cease to be sacred. And the implication is that other things might be sacred too. I mean, and I think Spinoza directly faces that. One of his critics says, well, look, as far as you're concerned, the Quran could be sacred. And he says, well, yes, it could. And so might other works of literature. So he opens up that very interesting question of whether the dependence on the Bible is a sort of contingent, local, historical matter that happens to work for us. But it doesn't mean that it would work for everybody.
So there's this battleground, as I see it, between the theologians and the philosophers. And there are the theologians that say everything must be subsumed by theology, including philosophy, and the philosophers who say, no, philosophy is triumphant and theology is in fact subsumed by philosophy. Now it looks like Spinoza is certainly a member of that latter group, but he does a bit of gymnastics to try to establish some sort of balance and say, well, actually, no, it's not the case that one is subsumed by the other, but they're just two very distinct realms. So my first question is, do you think he's successful in establishing that balance? And the second question is, why do you think he does that anyway?
Well, to answer the first question, we need to say a little bit about how he tries to pull these two apart. And here he takes a tack which is not completely novel to him, although he, as usual, gives it a twist. So he pulls them apart by saying theology and philosophy are really doing quite different things. Philosophy is after the truth, But theology is after what he calls obedience or piety. So we need to perhaps just drop back a tiny bit and say that Spinoza's investigation of the Bible leads him to the conclusion that, as it were, there is a moral teaching of the Bible, which you can extract from the prophecies of the whole lot. And that is just that you ought to love God and love your neighbour. It's an ethical teaching, it's nothing to do with physics. So then what the Bible requires us to do, what true religion amounts to, is just to do that. And the point of the Bible is how well, and the question is that you've just been asking is how well does it do that? So now, the point of religion is to, as it were, learn to live like that. That's what it is to be a properly religious person. And the job of theology is to sort of help us. And so these two projects are, on the face of things, separate, and Spinoza wants to say, well, each is just its own thing, and each can let the other be. They don't have to quarrel. As a matter of fact, though, it's not quite so simple, because Spinoza thinks that philosophy, like theology, can also vindicate moral doctrines. So the truths that you can extract from the Bible, you can also work out philosophically.
Which gives you certainty as well, presumably, right?
Yeah, it looks as though that's it kind of, in the long run, if you're philosophically minded, you are going to think that you are in the position to sort of test out the truth of what the theologians are saying in your own terms. And so it looks as though philosophy therefore has a kind of domination over theology. And another asymmetry, of course, is that philosophy ranges over all sorts of things, whereas theology, as Spinoza has presented it, has a very limited role. Right. It's just about these doctrines and how to realize them.
So I'm sympathetic to what he's saying as it happens, but I recognize that the way it would appear if I were a 17th century religious person in the Netherlands, or what later became the
United Provinces.
United Provinces, right, thank you. So if I were a religious person in the 17th century United Provinces, it would seem to me what he's saying is, okay, right, if you're a good philosopher and you're really clever and you're hardworking and industrious, then you can go from here to there, and eventually, after some time in trouble, you'll have some moral certainty that is associated with the sorts of truths that one would normally associate with religion and the Bible and so forth. If you're not such a good philosopher, well, then here's this wonderful narrative little story that you can grasp some lessons from, and you can derive some moral advancement from. But that's what it seems to me he's saying, and that seems like a fairly condescending view for somebody who's religious and who believes in the primacy of theology.
Well, he doesn't believe in the primacy of theology. He believes that they're...
No, that's what I'm saying. It would seem condescending if you were somebody who believes in the primacy of theology.
I see what you mean. Yes, absolutely. I think it did. And what can we say in Spinoza's defense? Well, perhaps that he thinks that, as it were, this capacity for reasoning is in all of us quite limited, and that we rely to a great extent on imagining. So that, take, even the best philosopher, as it isn't as though they will be able to do kind of everything in the philosophical mould, and they will never have any need of the kind of imaginative support that the Bible might give them. So you're dealing with people who are, as it were, not falling neatly into two camps, but who are always sort of somewhere in between. Each of us relies on both. But the imaginative effort, Spinoza thinks, can, because, as we were saying, it can take many forms. I think that's what's really troubling from the theological point of view, because it looks as though, we might have our own imaginative worlds which help us to observe the tenets of true religion, and it doesn't doesn't seem that they need to be very closely related to anything that's in the Bible.
Right, it could be the Quran or something, as you said before.
Or nothing that we recognize even as a sacred book.
Right.
Yeah.
So if one is watching this or listening to this, I can imagine one says, okay, well, this is all very interesting. If I happen to be a 17th century individual living in the United Provinces, theologically inclined or otherwise.
Yeah.
But I thought the whole point of what he was trying to do wasn't necessarily to pick a fight with the theologians or not pick a fight with the theologians, but was to demonstrate that the ability to philosophize was in fact necessary for a thriving society, and in fact necessary for the welfare of the Republic where he found himself. So there's this whole political aspect of this which has to tie in. So how does all this theology, how do all these disputes about theological orientation and versus philosophy, how does that somehow get turned into a political direction?
Well, the end of Spinoza's theological section of the argument is that the teaching of the Bible is very minimal. It's one that we can learn in the imaginative ways we've just been discussing. Insofar as we live like that, we do everything that religion requires of us. And then there's a sort of, in brackets, there are some sort of tenets of religion that you have to believe in order to do that. But basically our religious faith is displayed in our works. It's just a matter of living cooperatively, really. That's what it is to be a religious person. Now, then the question is, all right, so you have to live cooperatively. What's the relation of that to the state? And so Spinoza says this kind of cooperative life that I'm imagining here, or I'm advocating here, is a life where people live justly. But you can only live justly in the state where you live under an effective law. What kind of state might that be? Well, that has to be a state, Spinoza says, in which, as it were, you have a single sovereign. And here he's engaging in a debate about, whether the state should be ruled by the church or the civil authorities. And he comes down completely on the side of the civil authorities. So he says you have to live in a state where, as it were, the civil authorities, the civil sovereign, decrees what the law is, what counts in effect as living justly and thus obeying God. And unless you have somebody to tell you what that is, you won't manage to do it because there'll be no shared norms and you'll just end up fighting each other. So you won't do it anyway.
Right.
So that's the link. The link is, if that's what religion is, then we have to have some kind of political authority that will enforce it. What sort of authority will enforce it? The state, and in particular a civil sovereign. And so then we move into the question of, all right, so how much religious freedom and religious leeway, as it were, should a sovereign offer in order to make the state do its job, which is to allow us to live justly and cooperatively, allow us to live peacefully and securely.
Right.
That's the outline.
And how can this be interpreted as a recipe for religious plurality or at least tolerance amongst different religious orientations?
I think that's a really important bit, because Spinoza is saying, look, the requirements for living religiously are very minimal, and there are lots of ways you can do it. So, as it were, no one can say that, you have to believe this doctrine or that dogma, or you have to worship in this way, or you have to worship in that. So everything that I'm telling you is compatible with quite a lot of religious pluralism. So we've got these religious reasons for allowing pluralism. And the question is, what are the political reasons for allowing pluralism? And Spinoza's view is that a sovereign, as it were, will maintain its own power best if it doesn't try to suppress people. This is an entirely sort of pragmatic point. But that the sovereign has to take responsibility for deciding when a pluralistic way of life actually threatens the security of the state. So it's the security of the state which is the crucial thing the sovereign has to look after. And it sees the question of religious pluralism in that light. So we want a sovereign that, as it were, will allow as much religious pluralism as is compatible with the security of the state. Then Spinoza has quite a lot of arguments about how, states flourish in various ways, from being pluralistic politically. And then he says, nonetheless, somebody does have to draw the line. Somebody has to say when the arguments that people are offering are seditious and they really do threaten the fabric of the state. And that's the job of the sovereign. So that's the story.
And by a sovereign, of course, he doesn't necessarily mean one individual or monarch. He just means ruling body of some sort.
Yes, that's right. The ultimate power in the state. And in the kind of state that Spinoza is talking about, I mean, in the TTP, he's talking about what he calls a republic. And I think he thinks that a republic can take a number of constitutional forms. But it seems as though he's saying a more democratic republic is liable to be more secure if its institutions are properly organized, because after all, what you're trying to do is to create, as it were, maximally fruitful conditions of security and peace within the state. And the way to do that is, on the whole, to include people and allow them to voice their opinions rather than to stop them from doing that.
Yes.
So in the last work he writes, the Tractatus Politicus, which is unfinished and never published in his lifetime, he talks about various different kinds of constitutions which he thinks are all stable states. And the thing that's striking about them is that though some of them are called monarchies and some of them are called aristocracies, they're all, as it were, very broad-based. They have big assemblies. Where they have a king, they have tons of advisors and a very sort of complex system of, this assembly that makes decisions and gives advice to that assembly and so on.
Weren't his last words mentioning a democracy called democracy? Because I've heard some people try to justify this claim. I mean, people try to justify famous philosophers as everything, right? So I've heard some people try to say, well, he was really a Democrat. He was really the equivalent of a modern day Democrat, and he was saying something right about that, right in the last few words before he stopped.
It's true, because the last chapter of the TP is called On Democracy, and it's 2.5 pages or something. So it doesn't really get going. But what it does contain, which is upsetting, really, is a very vitriolic attack on the role of women rulers. And I think it is important to acknowledge that Spinoza's idea of a broadly based state is, by our standards, not democratic at all.
Sure. Let me get to a problem that I've always had with all of Spinoza's writings. And maybe this is just naive, but so my understanding of a core aspect of his philosophy is he makes some equivalent, I'm not talking about the Tractatus, but some fundamental equivalence between God and nature, and by nature meaning the laws of nature, and that